In 1970, the British aircraft industry had been stripped of its final saviour to remain competitive, when following a muddled and contentious divergence of interest between the pro-British business world and the pro-European government, a stalemate was reached where of the three options for BAe's new wide-body airliner, the state would provide its most minimal commitment through supporting Rolls-Royce in its supply of engines to the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar program. The other two options, the homegrown BAe A320 and the pan-European Airbus A320, were thus abandoned in December 1970, with the drop-in of the BAe A320 being seen with particular controversy, as this airliner was to be the very last attempt by the British aircraft industry to develop an indigenous wide-body airliner that would compete with the Airbus A320, the Douglas DC-10 and the Lockheed TriStar, and through its early market performance in pre-order numbers, had the potential to keep the British aircraft builders competitive against both its American and European adversaries. However, now that the BAe A320 had been abandoned, this left a major hole in the already struggling commercial arm of the British Aircraft Corporation, or BAC, as far as new projects were concerned, with the division being left with only two ongoing civil aircraft programs, the BAc 111 short-haul jet, whose annual sales were already down to a trickle by the early 1970s, and the joint development and production with Aerospatiale of France of the Concorde supersonic transport. Concorde had initially shown a relatively healthy provisional order book of some 74 options, with potential customers including Pan Am, TWA, Qantas, Lufthansa and more, but these soon evaporated in the aftermath of the 1973 oil shock, the restrictions on Concorde operations caused by sonic booms, and the fatal crash of the rival Tupolev Tu-144 at the 1973 Paris Air Show, which rumbled confidence in supersonic airliners overall, thus reducing Concorde's total output to just 20 units, including 2 prototypes and 2 pre-production aircraft. Siddely, on the other hand, still had the HS-121 Trident in production, although this aircraft too was entering the twilight years of its life, though major orders from the People's Republic of China for 33 Trident 2Es and 2 3Bs in 1972 and 1973 ensured that this British trijet continued in low-volume production until 1978, while the HS-748 twin-turboprop airliner remained a successful machine throughout the 1970s and 1980s, with a total of 382 built, and the company was also a major subcontractor to the Airbus A320, designing the entire wing and producing the aircraft's wing boxes, a package equivalent to an 80% share of the program's development and manufacture. Meanwhile, France's Aerospatiale was without doubt the best placed of the European civil aircraft companies in terms of future prospects, as in addition to co-developing the Concorde with BAC, Aerospatiale had won project leadership on the A300 scheme, which placed it at the very heart of European civil aircraft development and transformed Aerospatiale's Toulouse base into Europe's main aerospace centre. However, France's other gamble in the civil arena, Dassault's Mercure twin-jet 150-seat airliner, was to prove a total commercial failure, with only 12 aircraft produced between 1971 and 1975, and despite an abortive attempt in the mid-1970s to launch a 180-seat larger derivative called the Mercure 200, with McDonnell Douglas and Aerospatiale potentially forming a joint venture to build and market the aircraft, Dassault eventually exited the commercial airliner market for good and concentrated on business jets and military fighter aircraft. It was in this context that the British aircraft industry faced the daunting prospect that it would never see the backing of the UK government on domestically developed major airliner projects, and that the future was squarely set on pan-European initiatives, despite the fact that the BAe A320 required input from a widespread chain of suppliers and contributors that stretched across Europe, America and beyond, essentially meaning the project was, in and of itself, a pan-international venture with employment levels reaching into the high thousands on a global scale. However, with a lack of willingness from the state, in combination with ever-mounting startup costs for individual nations to develop commercial airliners solely on their own initiative, meant that Britain, France, and any other European nation could no longer afford a go-it-alone approach, with the only exception to this iron rule being the smaller 70 to 100-seat regional jet segment of the market, where the HS-146, later the BAe 146, and the Fokker F-100 and F-70 were launched as national programs, albeit without international risk-sharing. In April 1972, BAC announced the incorporation at Weybridge of Europlane Limited, a European airliner consortium tasked with studying new developments for the 1980s, which initially comprised BAC, Germany's MBB, and Sweden's Saab, with equal shares of 33.33% each, with the consortium expanded to include Spain's CASA, and its shares were reapportioned equally among the 4 participants at 25% each, with BAC's Alan Greenwood standing as chief executive of Europlane, while MBB's Heribert Flusdorf was appointed technical director. with initial studies concentrating on the development of BAC's own QTOL or Quiet Takeoff and Landing projects that had been on the drawing board for some time. 4 aircraft categories were investigated, with capacities for 70, 80, 115 and 180 passengers, and after further research, the partners decided to address the Boeing 737, Trident, DC-9 and BAC 111 replacement market, with the project being for a twin-aisle 180 to 200-seat aircraft, and details of this model were unveiled at the 1973 Paris Air Show, with the projected aircraft's basic parameters consisting of a double-load fuselage with a diameter of 15 foot 9 inches, with twin-aisle 7 abreast seating consisting of a 2-3-2 arrangement for 191 passengers at 34-inch pitch, or a maximum of 219 seats. Europlane would be powered by either 2 Rolls-Royce RB211 or General Electric CF650 engines, and had a range of 1,500 to 2,300 miles, with a takeoff field length of 5,900 feet. With the aircraft being designed from the outset to minimize noise footprint, being at least 10 decibels quieter than the FAR Part 36 requirements, and this engine choice would have enabled the aircraft to grow in size to between 260 and 270 seats, or to have an increased range for the datum passenger load by 1984, with BAC expecting that full go-ahead would be given by mid-1974, with service entry slotted for 1979, with the total launch cost being estimated at £180 to £200 billion, and BAC envisaged break-even sales of some 350 units, with the unit price being set at £5.3 million. Europlane's basic configuration and general lines bore a striking resemblance to the BAe 311, only slightly smaller in size, the main difference, apart from its dimensions, being the positioning of the rear engines, with these being raised up from the fuselage on pylons in a V-shape, shielding forward noise by using the wing, the fuselage to mask downward directed noise, and reducing rearward arc noise by acoustic treatment and full-length cowls, with this arrangement also allowing for the addition of fuselage plugs without upsetting the position of the engines relative to the wings. In many respects, Europlane was a return to the original BAC 211 project of 1967, although it benefited from several more years of technological development and from a wide-body fuselage, and if launched, it would have competed with the subsequent Boeing offerings of the 757 and its wide-body brother, the 767, as well as being a competitor to Airbus's A310, the shortened version of the A300B launched in 1978. With BAC's pedigree in civil aircraft production, combined with the technical and financial muscle of MBB, Saab and CASA, Europlane had the potential to achieve significant commercial success, though ultimately, 2 factors contributed to Europlane's demise, one being the 1973 oil crisis and the subsequent worldwide economic recession, which hit the air transport industry particularly hard, and MBB's position as a key partner in the Airbus industry consortium, with the latter situation meaning not only that MBB was deeply committed financially to the A300, but also that it found itself in a conflict of interest position when it came to launching the A300's smaller derivative, the A310. Europlane and the A310 would have been direct competitors in the same way that the 311 would have provided direct competition to the A300, and in the end, the commitment of MBB and the German government to their alliance with the French and to Airbus industry as the permanent European civil aerospace vehicle won the day, while at the same time Airbus had an aircraft about to enter airline service in the shape of the A300B, whereas the BAC-led Europlane consortium only had a paper aircraft, and by September 1973, the Europlane partners put the project in abeyance for a possible review in 6 months' time, with this effectively putting an end to the program. Meanwhile, despite the 211, 311 and Europlane sagas winding their course, BAC studied a number of advanced higher-capacity variants of its baseline short-haul twin-jet 111, with the appearance in the marketplace of the Boeing 737 and the continuous development of the original Douglas DC-9 into higher-capacity versions being the spur for the BAC studies. The first proposed development of the 111 emerged in 1967 and was dubbed the Series 600, with the 111-600 being some 3.6 meters longer than the Series 500, increasing passenger capacity by about 10 to 130 seats in higher density layout, while the wingspan was also increased by 3 meters, and the power plant was to be the aft-fan Rolls-Royce BAe with a bypass ratio of 4:1 and a thrust of 17,350 pounds. The 111 Series 700 was proposed in 1974, and this was again a stretched, more advanced development of the Series 500, with the fuselage length to be increased by 12 foot, allowing maximum seating capacity to increase from 119 to 134 in a wide-body look cabin, while power was to be provided by 2 new higher bypass ratio Rolls-Royce BAe 67C turbofans, each rated at 16,900 pounds, while the Series 700's maximum range would have been 2,300 miles, and the aircraft would have had a 6% better specific fuel consumption in the cruise than the Series 500. The Series 700 proposal was followed in 1975 by the larger Series 800 variant, with the Series 800 fuselage being some 32 foot 6 inches longer than the Series 500, allowing capacity to be increased to between 144 and 161 passengers, while power was to be provided by two new General Electric Snecma CFM56 turbofans of 22,000 pounds thrust each, and the wingspan was also increased by 10 foot over that of the Series 500. However, all of these proposals for BAc 111 expansions would ultimately come to naught, primarily due to the bankruptcy of Rolls-Royce in 1971, which saw the initial 111 be marginalised due to lack of engine supply against an increasingly constrained market, with the Boeing 737 and Douglas DC-9 ultimately turning the market for twin-engine regional jet airliners into a two-horse race that would dominate the 1970s and into the 1980s until the release of the Airbus A320. Siddely, meanwhile, were keen to retain a complete civil aircraft development capability to complement its Airbus work and to provide a successor to the Trident on the Hatfield production line, and after several studies of feeder liner jets dating back to the early 1970s, they settled on a high-wing, four-engine regional jet design powered by American Avco Lycoming ALF 502 turbofans. Dubbed the HS-146, so numbered as the 140th design from de Havilland at Hatfield, the project's definition phase was started in 1971, and by August 1973, Siddely and the British government had agreed on a launch aid package for the aircraft, whereby the government would undertake the financing of 50% of the project's non-recurring costs, with HSA covering the balance and undertaking to carry any cost overruns, with the HS-146 emerging a short takeoff and landing or STOL jet that was very quiet and will be developed in two versions, an 80-seater and a 100-seater, with the first flight being scheduled for 1975 and entry into service for 1977. At that time, the German-Dutch company VFW Fokker protested and filed complaints in Brussels against the British government's backing of the HS-146, which it saw as a direct competitor to its own Fokker F-28 and VFW 614 regional jetliners, with VFW Fokker arguing that no EEC member state should launch a go-it-alone aircraft when there were already similar European products in the market, and that in any case such aircraft projects should be carried out on a European joint venture basis. However, the British government and Siddely stood firm with the 146, countering that there was enough room in the market for a new aircraft, and that, save for larger and more complex projects like Concorde and Airbus, European cooperation was not necessarily the most efficient way to develop a civil aircraft, though little more than a year after agreeing the launch aid package with the government, in the autumn of 1974, HSA decided to terminate the HS-146 project unilaterally on the grounds that the severe recession in the airline industry in the wake of the 1973 oil crisis had made the project no longer economically viable. However, after much lobbying by the trade unions, and at the behest of the Minister of Technology Tony Benn, it was decided that low-key design and development of the HS-146 would continue with government backing, with a view to the project being reassessed at a later date by a new nationalised aircraft corporation, while at this stage, the Labour Party had returned to power and had pledged to nationalise the aircraft and guided weapons interests of BAC and Siddely. Eventually, in the summer of 1978, the newly formed British Aerospace decided to relaunch the HS-146 as the BAe 146 and obtain government approval to do so in July 1978, with the first BAe 146 being rolled out in May 1981 and first flew on September 3, 1981, with this being the first new British jet airliner to fly in over 18 years after the BAc 111 in 1963. Developed in three variants which differed fuselage lengths, including the 100 with a capacity for 74 to 93 passengers, the 200 with 85 to 112 passengers, and the 300 able to carry between 100 and 128 passengers, the BAe 146 at first struggled in the marketplace, but then established itself and achieved good market penetration, especially after the early problems with its Lycoming ALF 502 engines were fixed, and the improved Avro RJ series was introduced in 1993. However, the BAe 146 never made any money for British Aerospace and very nearly caused the collapse of the entire group in 1992, with this being the result of a commercial policy in the early days of the program of leasing the aircraft to small, financially unstable regional airlines, while BAe retained the recourse obligation, with the result being that a £1.2 billion write-off of leasing obligations in BAe's balance sheets and the company's near collapse. In the end, total BAe 146 Avro RJ production reached 394, of which 390 were delivered to over 60 operators worldwide, with the aircraft operated by the regional subsidiaries of major carriers such as United Airlines, Northwest, Air China, Air France, Alitalia, KLM, Lufthansa, Qantas, Swissair and Sabena, and was Britain's most numerically successful jetliner ever, and the country's second most successful airliner after the Vickers Viscount. However, as the initial proposal of the 146 was facing its termination, September 1974 saw the major European civil aircraft manufacturers announce at the Farnborough Air Show the formation of the Group of Six, a combination of BAC, HSA, Aerospatiale, MBB, Fokker VFW and Dornier, that would study the market and the specifications for a 130 to 150 seat twin-jet airliner that would compete with the Boeing 737 and Douglas DC-9 derivatives, as well as replace the various Boeing 727s, Caravels, Tridents and BAC 111s. In March 1975, Dassault Breguet joined the team, and the group was rechristened the Group of Seven, with both derivative and new designs being proposed, as based on the work that had been carried out by the individual manufacturers, among the new designs being Aerospatiale's AS200 twinjet, several concepts studied by BAC at Weybridge in the mid-1970s under a UK government-sponsored research programme, a number of single-aisle projects in the 150 to 190 seat bracket put forward by CAST or the Civil Aircraft Study Team, and a consortium formed by Fokker Siddely, VFW Fokker and Dornier, with design offices at Hatfield and Bremen. The general configurations of the Aerospatiale AS200 and of the most conventional among the BAC Weybridge and CAST concepts were very similar, with two 10-ton engines mounted on pylons under the wings, thus creating, in essence, a single-aisle equivalent to the Airbus A320, while the derivative designs comprised four separate entries, the BAC 111 Series 600, the Hawker Siddeley Trident 4 and Trident 5, and the Dassault Mercure 200. The Trident 4 was a three-engine stretch of the Trident 3, seating 180 passengers and driven by more powerful Rolls-Royce BAe engines, whereas the Trident 5 was a twin-engined 150-seat Trident development powered by two 10-ton engines and with a redesigned wing of 23-degree sweep as opposed to the original 35-degree sweep of the Trident, and the Mercure 200 was a stretched re-engined version of the original Mercure, with capacity increased to 180 passengers and with a greater range than the underperforming original. In the end, the Group of Seven decided to concentrate their studies on a derivative design, and the Mercure 200 was chosen as the preferred baseline, leading BAC and HSA to drop their respective derivative proposals, while Dassault became project leader within the Group of Seven, and at the time, the specialist press reported that both BAC and HSA did not object to the Mercure 200 being the basis for the new pan-European 150-seater, and that they accepted in principle French design leadership on the two new European civil subsonic jetliners, including the A320B10 and the Mercure 200. The British group's statement clearly seemed to suggest that Britain's main civil players were by then demoralised and crestfallen, aware of their government's lukewarm attitude to launching new civil aircraft, and thus they were prepared to play second fiddle to France as a means of getting at least some share of the action, while on technical grounds, the British teams, and HSA in particular, recognised the Mercure 200's superior six-abreast cabin cross-section, which was wider than either the Trident's or the 111's cabins and general arrangement. However, the Group of Seven eventually dispersed to be replaced by a new consortium called JET, or the Joint European Transport, with the Mercure 200 never seeing the light of day, despite French attempts to keep it alive by forming a joint venture with McDonnell Douglas of the United States and with other European companies, the plan having been that Dassault would be the design leader with a 5% stake in the joint venture, with Aerospatiale taking a 40% stake with responsibility for final assembly and flight test, and McDonnell Douglas taking a 15% share, and the remaining 40% industrial share would be available to the other interested European parties. However, this French-led plan came to nothing, and, as a consequence, Dassault exited the civil aircraft business for good, while the JET Consortium, which inherited the work done by the Group of Seven, was established in June 1977 by the then Airbus partners Aerospatiale, MBB and VFW Fokker, together with the newly formed British Aerospace, which had resulted from the combination and nationalisation in April 1977 of BAC, Hawker Siddeley Aviation, Hawker Siddeley Dynamics and Scottish Aviation. British Aerospace was invited to join by reason of the important role that HSA played in the A320B programme, and because BAC itself had substantial expertise in civil aircraft design, with the joint engineering team of JET being based at BAC's Weybridge facility and was headed by HSA's Derek Brown, while in addition to studying all new designs, the Jet Consortium seriously evaluated a new proposal from BAC, the derivative BAC X11. First proposed in the summer of 1976, the X11 was a scaled-up development of the 111 Series 800, but this time the aircraft was given a wider six-abreast cabin of 143 inches in width, and the X11 would have shared about 40% of its components with the 111, including the nose and rear fuselage sections, together with scaled-up wings, fin and tailplane, with three versions of the X11 being planned: the Series 100 with a capacity for 130 passengers, the Series 200 as the baseline model with 144 passenger capacity, and the Series 300 for 156 passengers. The BAC X11 Series 200 would be 132 foot 2 inches in length with a 106 foot 2 inch wingspan, while also sporting a maximum takeoff weight of 140,000 pounds and a range of 2,300 miles. But unlike the Rolls-Royce powered BAC 111, the X11 would employ either the CFM56 turbofans from the upcoming Boeing 737-300, 400 and 500, while an alternative was the Pratt & Whitney JT10D, an experimental design that was to be employed by the McDonnell Douglas YC-15 prototype and would later find its way onto variants of the Boeing 757. BAC predicted a break-even figure for the X11 of 400 units, based on a go-ahead in the second half of 1977, with British Airways, Lufthansa, Bavaria, American Airlines and South African Airways expressing considerable interest in the X11 proposal, and BAC put the project forward to the HSA board for consideration in early 1977 in advance of the nationalisation of the two companies. HSA had expressed doubts about the X11's attractiveness, preferring the Mercure 200 or any similar project, such as the Aerospatiale AS200, and despite strong market interest in the BAC X11, which would have provided the aircraft with a sound launch base of prestigious customers, the jet partners, other than BAC, were not at all keen on a derivative aircraft. Having discarded the X11, the multinational engineering team at Weybridge concentrated on an all-new design that drew strong inspiration from proof-of-concept work done by BAC at Weybridge in the early 1970s and from the Aerospatiale AS200 proposal, as apart from the X11 proposal, BAC Weybridge had studied all-new 150-seat designs in the early 1970s. These concepts had their origin in the joint company government-funded RSTOL, or Reduced Short Takeoff and Landing Aircraft Studies, which started in the UK in 1972 and continued with the CTOL, or Conventional Takeoff and Landing contract, well into 1976, with the overall design studies sequentially numbering each configuration, and the underwing-mounted twin CFM56-engined aircraft was known as Aircraft 36 and was developed to a fairly detailed level. The final iteration of Aircraft 36 resulted in a twin-engined airliner with 145 seats at 34-inch pitch and a 23-degree swept wing, with Aircraft 36 showing a remarkable configuration similarity to the definitive Airbus A320, the main difference being in fuselage cross-section, with Aircraft 36 having a double bubble shape capable of taking full LD3 containers, while the A320 had a more nearly circular fuselage, which gave a higher standard of passenger accommodation with the ability to accept cut-down LD3 containers below the cabin floor. Using the Aerospatiale AS200 and BAC's Aircraft 36 as blueprints, the jet team at Weybridge eventually designed two versions of a twin-engine transport with underwing-mounted CFM56s, these being Jet 1, comprising 150 seats as the base model, and Jet 2 with the enlarged 180-seat version. But given France and Germany's commitment to Airbus industry as the permanent vehicle for European civil aircraft development, it was felt that the only route by which the jet aircraft could proceed was to sell the concept to Airbus, and thus the jet team arranged to present the proposals to them. Initially, Airbus saw the aircraft as narrow-bodied, and this did not fit their marketing image, though the jet team eventually came up with the idea of a single-aisle or SA and twin-aisle or TA aircraft designation to distinguish between the single-aisle jet project and the traditional Airbus wide-bodies, the A300 and the A310, and their twin-aisle developments, with this nomenclature being accepted by Airbus at the presentation of the jet aircraft, and the jet design subsequently became SA1 and SA2, and the larger Airbus projects became TA9 or the A330 and TA11 or the A340. A single-aisle engineering team was set up in the old airport terminal buildings at Toulouse, which over time became integrated with the main Airbus project office. But before proceeding too far with the SA projects, a limited marketing exercise was carried out in the USA, and this, in addition to a meeting between Roger Bataille of Airbus, André Borde of Aerospatiale, and Roger Backer of BAC and later British Aerospace, led to an agreement to proceed with an aircraft midway between the SA-1 and SA-2, called internally the SA-150. The original fuselage cross-section of the jet designs was modified to accommodate a cut-down LD3 container, or 20 inches off the top of a standard container, and with an increase of 1 inch in each seat width and the aisle width, with the latest BAe-designed wing iteration of BAC's Aircraft 36 with increased rear span depth also being incorporated, and the aircraft was eventually launched as the Airbus A320. However, with the shelving of the X-11 and the transfer of the jet project from its Weybridge base to Airbus in Toulouse, BAC and later British Aerospace effectively ceded project leadership to Aerospatiale and to France on the European single-aisle 150-seater, and accepted a subordinate role in the development of large civil aircraft, and thus the reversal of roles in civil aircraft between Europe's two leading aerospace industries, which had begun when the British government decided not to support the BAC 311, was confirmed once and for all with Britain's agreement to back France's project leadership and Europe's next mainline civil aircraft. Additionally, France retained leadership of the Airbus family of wide-bodies that was spawned from the original Airbus A320, though ironically, it was during this very period of the early 1970s that government ministers in charge of aerospace and aerospace industry leaders alike woke up to the fact that Britain was losing the plot in the commercial airliner segment. Unfortunately, despite major figures like Michael Heseltine, Conservative Minister for Aerospace and Shipping, the realization on the part of the country's decision-makers that Britain had given away more than it had received in the European aerospace joint ventures in which it had participated came too late to change the new status quo, at least as far as civil aerospace was concerned. Through the establishment of Airbus industry with the Germans in 1970, France had wrested leadership of commercial aircraft development from Britain, and through its A320 wide-body twin-jet airliner, Airbus industry had the most modern and competitive European subsonic jet transport in production, and was beginning to gain market share from the Americans, while aside from HSA's participation in Airbus as supplier of the A320's wings, Britain had no new large airliner in production, its only paper proposals relating to developments of its long-standing 111 and Trident jetliners. It came as no surprise, therefore, that France asserted itself when it came to the next major European project, and that Airbus industry was the chosen vehicle to develop and produce the new 150-seat European twin-jet airliner, while to the emasculated British Aerospace, the only future alternatives for its commercial aircraft business were either to rejoin Airbus industry as a full partner, or to find some sort of partnership agreement with the American giants Boeing or McDonnell Douglas. The most pressing decisions for the nationalized corporation, British Aerospace, were in connection with its commercial aircraft business, with the military side of the business being quite healthy, as the Panavia Tornado multi-role aircraft was in full production, the Sepcat Jaguar ground attack and close support fighter was rolling off the assembly lines in quantity for the British, French and overseas air forces, and the Harrier AV-8B and Hawk military aircraft also boasted healthy order books, with a similar pattern emerging for the combined guided weapons divisions of BAe and to a lesser degree for its satellite and communications business. The company's civil aircraft business was in a far less happy state, with production of the Concorde supersonic airliner terminating with the delivery of the 16th production example in early 1979, after an agreement had been reached with France in 1974 not to proceed beyond 16 production aircraft, as divided equally between Aerospatiale at Toulouse and BAe-BAC at Felton, Bristol, while the BAC 111 twin-jet airliner was nearing the end of its life, with little prospect for further major orders. The same situation applied to the Trident trijet, with the last order from China being taken in 1973, and by 1977 Hawker Siddely had stopped direct marketing of the aircraft, with Trident production ending in July 1978, while the only bright spots within civil aircraft were the HS-748 twin turboprop, which continued to sell steadily, albeit in small numbers, and the HS-125 business jet, which still boasted a healthy order backlog. As the management of the former BAC elected to concentrate on the profitable military aircraft and guided weapons businesses, it was decided to give over responsibility for the civil aircraft side of the business to the ex-HSA management, and thus the new BAE board's decisions in terms of future civil projects came down in favour of launching the HS-146 regional jet as a go-it-alone venture, and of coming to some joint partnership agreement with either Airbus Industry or the Americans as far as aircraft over 100 seats were concerned. The BAE board recognized that to launch a 311 or Airbus A320 class large airliner would be far too expensive and risky to contemplate alone, with as early as 1976 having seen informal meetings between Lord Beswick, BAE chairman-designate, and General Jacques Mitterrand, head of Aerospatiale, to explore the shape of BAE's relationship with Airbus going forward. Talks range from the idea that BAE would continue as a privileged subcontractor on the wings to the possibility of rejoining Airbus as a full partner, though any firm decision had to be postponed until the formal completion of BAE's formation, while the discussions and negotiations that eventually brought the civil airframe business of BAE back into the Airbus fold as a full partner were long, drawn-out, difficult and politically sensitive, and were to take over 1 year to complete. The political sensitivity of the choice meant that Britain's then Prime Minister, Labour's James Callaghan, was directly involved in the discussions, leaving British Aerospace with 2 realistic alternative choices at its disposal in terms of partnership on large civil aircraft, with the first seeing British Aerospace to formally rejoin the Airbus Industry Consortium as a full partner, while the second was for British Aerospace to join Boeing in the development of the latter's 757 twinjet. A third, but much more nebulous option, was for British Aerospace, McDonnell Douglas and Airbus to collaborate on a totally new mid-range, mid-capacity twin, though this third option, favoured in many respects by Prime Minister Callaghan, never looked realistic, all while the Airbus camp had the full political backing of the President of France, Giscard d'Estaing, and of the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, as well as the support of the British Foreign Office and the British Ambassador in Paris, Sir Nicholas Henderson. The Boeing proposal, on the other hand, was cleverly crafted, as not only was British Airways keen to order the Boeing 757 aircraft, essentially as a model that would fill the void of the abandoned BAe 211 of the previous decade, but also the initial version of the aircraft was to be powered by Rolls-Royce's new RB211 535 turbofan, an advanced reduced thrust version of the original RB211. In addition, Boeing was offering British Aerospace the contract to design and manufacture the 757's wings, and in this instance acknowledged Hawker Siddeley's advanced wing expertise, as demonstrated in its work on the A320, and therefore, from the start, Boeing had the backing of 2 of Britain's premier civil aviation corporations in British Airways and Rolls-Royce, as well as the support of many government departments, senior ministers and civil servants, especially in the Treasury. Many senior officials thought that the Boeing proposal had a far better chance of market success than any partnership with Airbus, while also believing that a transatlantic partnership with Boeing had the additional advantage of helping British Aerospace achieve greater manufacturing efficiency and cost effectiveness, with BAE's productivity at the time not being as good as Boeing's. The British Aerospace Board was far less enthusiastic about the 757 and more suspicious of Boeing's intentions, feeling that Boeing saw the British industry as merely a subcontractor, and though Boeing improved its offer to British Aerospace on the 757 by suggesting that the British corporation would get further work on the empennage of the aircraft and some final assembly work, at no stage was it prepared to form a partnership or joint venture company with BAE to develop the 757. Indeed, Boeing's proposals left the British with no say in the marketing, systems integration and flight testing functions, while moreover, the Boeing fixed-price contract proposal on the 757 wings left little or no scope for cost inflation, thus subjecting BAE to the risk of losing money on the deal, and additionally, Boeing was not in a position to guarantee any further collaboration beyond the 757, with British Aerospace soon coming to the conclusion that a full partnership with Airbus offered a more secure future, and a more senior role in the development of the aircraft and the preservation of the company's civil aircraft expertise. After a meeting with Boeing's senior management in the United States, James Callaghan himself developed an antipathy to what he perceived to be Boeing's condescension towards the British, and he was reported as saying that, during his meeting with Ten Bullion and T. Wilson of Boeing, that he was being talked down to, and that the Boeing chiefs treated the British delegation as representatives of an underdeveloped country. Regardless of Callaghan's sensitivities in connection with Boeing's blunt style in the discussions, it was evident that Boeing saw British Aerospace as a mere subcontractor and nothing more, while during the same visit to America, Callaghan also met with Eastern Airlines chairman, former astronaut Frank Borman, who was happy to tell Callaghan that the Airbus A320s in his fleet were turning out to be very reliable and economical, with this news leading to a warming of opinion among the cabinet towards BAE rejoining Airbus as the corporation's board itself wished. However, the Airbus partners, particularly the French, set down some conditions for Britain to rejoin the consortium, the principal of which was that the British government should pay an entry fee of £200 million as a contribution towards A320B sunk development costs, and that British Airways should order a sizable number of A320Bs or the new A310s to underpin Britain's commitment to the European aircraft. Of the various conditions, that of the forced British Airways order was totally unacceptable to the British government, which made it clear to the French that a UK government could not overrule the independence of the corporation's board in terms of commercial policy decisions, a viewpoint the French government could not understand, as in France all of the states' corporations pulled in unison in the same direction for the greater benefit of the country, and it was given, therefore, that Air France would order the Airbus products. Matters would ultimately come to a head in July 1978, when the French and the Germans decided to launch the derivative Airbus A310 with or without the involvement of the UK, while at the same time, the British government approved British Airways' purchase of 19 Boeing 757s powered by Rolls-Royce RB211 535s, while Eastern Airlines' order for an additional 21 Rolls-Royce powered 757s effectively launched the Boeing program. And during the same announcement by Trade and Industry Minister Eric Varley, the British government authorised British Aerospace to complete negotiations for joining Airbus as a full partner. The approval of the British Airways order for Boeing 757s incensed the French, as apart from the fact that 757 was regarded as a direct competitor to Airbus's new A310, the French resented the fact that it would please all of the UK's big three aviation companies, while also fatally weakening Europe's attempts through Airbus to build a durable competitor to the USA's stranglehold in civil aerospace, with the French government declaring that either there would be a British Airways order for the Airbus, or there would be no deal for BAe. Two concomitant events were to solve the impasse between Britain and France, with the first being Airbus's failure to find a credible alternative source of wings for the new A310, as despite the importance of a new wing design, very few companies in mainland Europe were competent or willing to undertake such a major project, while the second was the decision by Sir Freddie Laker, chairman of British independent carrier Laker Airways, to order 10 Airbus A320B wide-body aircraft. Laker's order forced the UK back into Airbus's fold while allowing it to save face by justifying the choice for Boeing 757s for British Airways as competition in the market, while Laker himself did not take too severely with BA's order for the 757s, since in the event very few service aircraft were required in his fleet, and the order was more a public relations coup than a fleet replacement, with it in fact being a terrible indictment that a major European project, which could have easily been supplied instead by possible partners further afield, should have depended for its success on the order of an independent British carrier. Regardless, the Laker deal finally paved the way for British Aerospace to rejoin Airbus as a full partner with a 20% share, while the remaining Airbus two main shareholders of Aerospatiale and Deutsche Airbus's holdings were fixed at 37.5% each, thus reducing British Aerospace's stake by 2.5% in order to protect Airbus's two smaller shareholders from dilution of their percentage participation. The British government also agreed to contribute £50 million towards Airbus's launch costs, a compromise between the £200 million requested by the French and the £25 million initially offered by Britain, and with effect from January 1, 1979, British Aerospace became a full partner of Airbus, with this later agreement concluding the long-drawn-out saga of Britain's checkered participation in Europe's civil aircraft industry, which had started in July 1969 when Britain withdrew from the original Airbus Accord and continued with the cancellation of the BAe 311 project in December 1970. British Aerospace's final agreement in 1978 was about half the 37.5% stake that HSA had originally held in the consortium, which equated to slightly more than the manufacturing share that Hawker Siddely had been able to negotiate in July 1969, and basically corresponded to the design and manufacture of the wing box, excluding the secondary structure and the moving surfaces such as flaps and slats. On completion of the negotiations concerning the BAe order for Rolls-Royce-powered Boeing 757s and British Aerospace's re-entry into Airbus, James Callaghan expressed great satisfaction as to the outcome achieved by the government, and while it did achieve the goal of meeting the wishes of all three major corporations concerned, and of exposing the British aerospace industry to both the US and European industries and markets, the emasculated and demoralised British civil airframe industry was bereft of a major autonomous civil airliner program of its own, or a major share in the increasingly successful Airbus project, and found itself in a much weaker bargaining position. The British dislike for high-risk, long-term investment propositions, both at industry and government level, also played a key part in the scaling down of British ambitions in civil aircraft production, and the industry was therefore left to agree a deal with the French and Germans that just about saved its collective face and honour. In the end, the much reduced share of the Airbus programs that was given to Britain reflected the cost of the missed opportunities which had resulted from the first withdrawing from Airbus in 1969. And then refusing to support the BAe 311 at the end of 1970, as by 1978, the French and German-backed Airbus consortium had a fully operational large jetliner in service and were developing its advanced derivative in the A310. Meanwhile, the mainstream British aircraft industry, as an independent entity beyond its contributions to Airbus, was left roaming the bottom end of the commercial market with some notable successes like the BAe 146, the Jetstream and the 125 private jet, but was also left to carry the burden of major missteps such as the Advanced Turboprop or ATP, which attempted to refresh the 20-year-old HS-748 airliner for the 1980s, but ended up failing catastrophically against a new breed of regional turboprop in the form of the ATR-42 and the de Havilland-8. Essentially, the 1992 global economic recession would be the catalyst as to British Aerospace's final retreat from the civil aviation market, with the near collapse caused by the lack of capital earned from the 146 due to the early leasing program, with its continued existence only secured through the sale of Jetstream and 125 airliners. The company set its new course of focusing on military contracts such as the upcoming Eurofighter Typhoon and maintaining the existing fleet of Harriers and Nimrods for the RAF. Otherwise, British Aerospace's involvement in the civil aircraft sector will continue so long as its products remain profitable, with the ATP being the first to end its days in 1996 after sustained losses, while the once highly profitable Jetstream range was axed in 1997 after the failure of the enlarged Jetstream 41 to win over the same market segment as the earlier Jetstream 31, while the BAe 125 private jet was sold to Raytheon of America in 1993 in order to drum up short-term capital to cover British Aerospace's debts coming out of the recession the previous year. Thus, only the BAe 146, refaced as the Avro RJ, remained in production into the new millennium as the last lingering mainstream product of the British civil aviation industry beyond the Britten-Norman Islander. But despite this model being lined up for a highly advanced successor in the form of the Avro RJX in the early 2000s, the fallout of the September 11th attacks and the subsequent aviation market downturn, combined with an increasingly constrained market filled with younger rivals, led to British Aerospace exiting the civil market altogether, and the 146 would see out the last of its units in November 2001. In the end, the British civil aerospace industry paid the ultimate price for short-term, risk-averse, myopic decisions by its leaders and political muddling by government in civil aerospace policy, with the price being the loss of large airliner design leadership to France and a junior position within Airbus by the beginning of the 1980s, with a lack of state commitment to support homegrown industries putting the business firmly in a corner, with each bold new proposal shot down before it ever left the drawing board by a government willing to divest the finest of Britain's technological knowledge and expertise to the likes of Airbus and Boeing. This, in essence, confirmed that, from its once commanding position in European aviation, the UK's civil aircraft building capabilities, formerly holding a prestige on par with the United States, was now to be relegated to the bread-and-butter work of subcontracting for more successful contemporaries, or, like the car industry, would be made up of individual workshops building small-sized models like the Britten-Norman Islander, aircraft that may sell well on the rugged remote markets of the world, but no longer fly among the big players of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, with that mantle having been ceded well and truly to Airbus.